On this episode of the End of Tourism podcast.
One of the most memorable takeaways that I had from this film is just the massive amount of greenwashing and deception that exists within the industry. I came to know a lot of companies that appeared to just be normal travel companies doing the same thing that has been going on in the travel industry, but marketing green, although nothing really changes. It's just their marketing strategy that's changed. So we really need to ask deeper questions. It's the trend in the industry now to use this type of language: sustainable, responsible, eco, all of these buzzwords. And I've just come to find these completely meaningless in those terms. We really need to ask some deeper, more challenging questions.
Welcome to the End of Tourism. Conversations on wanderlust, exile, and radical hospitality. A quick reminder that the podcast lives on a gift economy model, which means that anyone, anywhere can listen, regardless of their economic situation. Your gift ensures it stays that way, free of advertisements and members-only paywalls. It allows me to devote a great deal of time to this project, to pay for the software and hardware that makes the podcast possible, as well as all of the production and post-production labor. In order to keep the project fed, you can subscribe by making monthly, annual, or one-time offerings at chrischristou.substack.com, where you'll also have access to my writing on these and other subjects, including food culture, psychedelics, media ecology, and myth. You can also support us by leaving a review for the pod on Apple or Spotify, by sharing the episodes with your friends, and by following us on social media via the handle, The End of Tourism. On this episode, my guests are Jesse Mann and Tyson Sadler, the two brains behind the documentary The Last Tourist. Jesse is both a picture editor and director whose professional work has spanned commercial, TV, and film projects. The Last Tourist is her second feature film as editor. Her first film as both editor and director, Material Success, screened internationally and won the Audience Choice at the Canadian Film Festival and Best Film at the Canadian Film Festival. Most recently, she both directed and edited the online horror miniseries The Confinement. She's a member of the Directors Guild of Canada and an associate member of the Canadian Cinema Editors. Jesse has a B.F.A. from Ryerson University's School of Image Arts. Tyson Sadler is an explorer, traveler, and award-winning filmmaker. He has directed video content and documentaries for the New York Times, Associated Press, and the Huffington Post. His films have been screened at festivals around the world, including Tribeca Film Festival, South by Southwest, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and the Toronto International Film Festival. An early pioneer in virtual reality documentary, he has worked tirelessly to use cutting-edge technology to tell stories that build empathy around causes such as climate change, forced migration, and human rights. Now a note from the director. For the past 2.5 years, this film took us on a journey to 14 different countries where we interviewed dozens of leading travel experts, tour operators, academics, as well as travelers and service workers in host communities who are leveraging tourism to improve their quality of life. In the process, we amassed nearly 400 hours of footage that was edited into a 90-minute film that pulls back the curtain and shows us the true cost of travel on the environment, wildlife, and host communities. You can find the trailer for the film as well as a link to watch it in full via the End of Tourism Substack. Welcome, Jesse and Tyson, to the End of Tourism podcast.
Thanks, Chris, for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your documentary film, The Last Tourist. And so it was released in 2022 to great reception, and as you might imagine, many of my listeners have pointed me in its direction. And after watching the film, I found myself really grateful that people finally approached these themes in the medium of documentary filmmaking and with what seemed to be a budget to do justice to what those themes confront. And so first, I'd like to ask you to how The Last Tourist got started and what the inspiration behind the film's creation was, and how did you decide to write a treatment for it?
Ultimately, I think the inspiration for The Last Tourist came from a combination of personal shared experience and a shared passion for travel, and particularly responsible travel. In early 2018, I was approached by the executive producers to write a treatment, a short film around responsible tourism in the country of Peru. And through, some follow-up, conversations, we sort of quickly realized that we had an opportunity because a large-scale documentary on the subject of responsible tourism just didn't exist yet. I mean, we have wonderful films out there which challenge our conversations with our relationship with climate change and our relationship with our food source, like An Inconvenient Truth or like Food Inc. But we didn't at that time yet have a documentary which really challenged our perceptions of the global impact of the travel and tourism industry. And so over conversations with our team and the producers, we quickly realized that we had a unique opportunity to make An Inconvenient Truth for the travel industry. And in early 2018, we seized on that opportunity to explore the positive and negative impacts of tourism on destinations.
And I think just to add to what Tyson was saying, I think originally it started off as a short project, and yourself and the executive producers who brought us together kind of pushed for it to become the large scale project that it ended up being, filmed in 15 different countries or 16 with 400 hours of footage. So sometimes you don't know, especially myself as a co-writer and editor, when you come onto a project, in the initial stages, you think, oh, this is wonderful. This sounds like a great project. I had been an avid traveler, lived in a few different countries over 20 years. And I thought, yeah, this is a story that needs to be told. But I will say, in no way in the beginning did I ever think it was going to be, and I think Tyson didn't either, was it going to be such a huge project. And you comment, Chris, on the expansiveness of the subject and the different kind of facets of the tourism industry we were able to look at. And really, I have to say that I'm happy that we got to touch on all those points, and to the chagrin of my personal sleep and Tyson's as well. But it started off small, I have to say that, and it grew into something tremendous that I think we're very proud of.
It really was a natural progression of our desire to raise awareness about responsible tourism and its consequences. We had our world premiere, honestly, I think it was about 2 years ago now at the Vancouver International Film Festival, 2 years ago. And
a little over 2 years ago.
A little over 2 years ago. And the film is still doing a festival run. Just last weekend, Jesse was at the Innsbruck Film Festival. And it's still been getting a wonderful response, great conversations around it. And we're streaming on platforms around the world, like Crave in Canada, Hulu in the US, Amazon Prime in other countries. I was just in French Polynesia and was able to find our film on Amazon Prime, which was really delightful to see that.
Yeah, it makes us happy as filmmakers to know that the story that we spent a lot of time trying to create in a way that we thought would connect with audiences worldwide is actually getting out there. And so it's really nice to be speaking to you on your podcast as well, and kind of extend that out to potentially more people who haven't seen the film, or some who just want to talk more about the topics.
And I wanted to ask you too, given the fact that the film was released, still very much in a pandemic during the COVID-19 times, what the reactions were, given the fact that tourism had ground to a halt in that time. I received a lot of mail regarding your film, like, you have to check this out, you have to watch this, right? And so a lot of people really excited about the project, about the film. But then I guess I'm also curious about if there was much of an industry backlash in regards to the degree of sincerity, perhaps, around which the film exhibited these kind of deep and sometimes dire consequences that visit themselves on places and people in the name of tourism.
Yeah, I think the reactions to the film have been, in my experience, almost entirely positive, but people don't come to me with criticism. They come to me with congratulations. But I think there's a lot of individuals in the tourism industry, when responsible travelers, that have really welcomed our film, The Last Tourist, as a necessary and eye-opening piece of work. It sparked a lot of interesting conversations and prompted the industry to, in many ways, I think, reevaluate some of their practices.
If we back it up to when we were meeting with all of the different professionals that we interviewed across the different facets of the tourism industry. I mean, when you and I were writing the story, there were so many different conflicting opinions on how to solve one issue that we still come across that sometimes when we meet those industry experts outside of, let's say, film audiences. Because when we were writing it, we had to kind of decide which side of the coin we were going to follow through our story with. And whether it's a topic of, let's say, regulation. That was a topic that Tyson and I had a lot of conversations about when we were making the film, because the industry in itself is kind of very polarized in terms of regulation. There's some strong proponents within the tourism industry who want regulation. And then there's some who are very against it. And Tyson and I had a lot of conversations about that. And I think we still do when we meet certain industry professionals out there. But I think that's a really important topic as well, now that you are bringing up post-COVID and the pandemic, where we saw kind of what happens when things are shut down. We see both the positive and the negative. I mean, we mentioned it in the film, but almost every single person that we interviewed in our film lost their means of income during that time, gone. And at the same time, the world experienced kind of, a refuge from, airplane emissions and damage to destination. And, these were calculable things. Like, we could see that this was a definite impact. So I think there's these kind of topics, and these conversations are where we see a lot of polarity. And I think that we tried our best to focus on the people and the developing nations in our story. But there are a lot of stories that were left on the cutting room floor. And so it is good to discuss them after in a podcast like this. I know that's kind of a long-winded interjection, but I do believe that we do have some polarity for sure. Tyson and I come across, but just not in terms of what Tyson's talking about, in terms of not so much with the audiences. It is more a bit in the industry.
I'll share an observation. During the process of creating this film, we interviewed literally dozens of travel experts, from academics to tour operators across the industry. It's universally recognized that responsible tourism and sustainable tourism is a good thing. But then when we dive a little bit deeper, I found a very fractured kind of industry, because everybody believes that they know how to do responsible tourism right, and everybody else often isn't executing responsible tourism correctly. And so on a foundational level, sure, we all believe in responsible tourism, but I think the approach at how we get there isn't universally accepted throughout the industry. And I think that that's on a basic level, we kind of explore those themes in the film, as well as we interview people who kind of take different approaches to how to engage responsibly with tourists and host communities.
And we had to make some hard decisions, obviously based on the research that was coming in on what side we wanted to promote in the story. But sometimes I think it's fair to say, Tyson, if you agree with me, that we did try to leave it a bit more open for audiences to try to make their own decision based on what we had learned, because there's not always an easy answer for every situation. It's quite nuanced, I think.
Absolutely.
And we mentioned, Jesse, regulation. In terms of the people you interviewed and your research, generally speaking, what does that look like, or what might that look like in particular locales or within the industry?
Well, I think we've seen quite a bit of it post-pandemic, because where we thought there was going to be an ease back into traveling, that has not happened. All the reports are coming back in that tourism is back up in droves, and a lot of the same problems, if not more, are back with travel again. And so we've seen places like Machu Picchu has started regulating the amount of people that are able to visit annually. Worldwide, there's different popular tourist destinations who have decided to limit the amount of tourism and tourists that come to certain destinations. I think when it comes to destinations, we just have to be really careful that it doesn't become a tax that is elitist, because that happens a lot with regulation across the board. You've seen it with cigarettes. You've seen it with airfare as well. You're paying a higher price for travel. And although I do believe personally, and Tyson, you can speak to this as well, but because we haven't discussed this recently, but when you put a strong tariff or tax on travel, I think it is important, but I think it has to be calculated so that it's not elitist. Because if we only have people traveling in the world who can afford it, if it becomes so unaffordable, this is totally against the core value of travel, which is to unite all people of all different socioeconomic statuses and really connect with different cultures and people. And if it's just suddenly becomes for people who can afford a really overpriced flight, I think that will completely take away the value, the core value of travel. But I do strongly believe that, and this I think is a very controversial thing to say, I do believe that things have to be regulated and there has to be something done, especially about the amount of flights that are happening on this planet. Because, for instance, I don't know the statistics for Canada, but I was looking at it the other day for the UK. And I think something like 70% of all flights in the UK are taken by 15% of the population. And I don't doubt that that's very similar for a lot of the Western world, without knowing all the statistics specifically. So I think that has to be really taken into consideration when putting out regulation in terms of flights or destinations and such.
Yeah, I've thought about it quite a bit as well. The elitization of travel and this understanding that, well, if we remove subsidies, for example, for air travel or other things, that we'll just have rich people flying around the world, which is more often than not the case already. Most flights are undertaken for business travel. And that's a huge thing that I think most people don't know about. But instead of getting people with corporate-backed funds or just rich people flying around the world, we're obviously looking for people with strong principles and good behavior to be the ones traveling. But then how do you measure that? How do you quantify that in a way that honors the kinds of worlds we want to live in? And it's not just this like, oh, it's impossible. Sure. And we could take that understanding that to quantify such a thing would be next to impossible. But then it could also open up these kind of doors of imagination wherein like, what kind of infrastructures would we want to put in place that were not maybe government sanctioned, were not maybe top down, but actually from the bottom up, creating these kind of international or intercultural bonds and practices between people that would allow not just for the kinds of people who locals in quote unquote destinations want to receive to be able to travel, but then also to create the conditions whereby that kind of, for lack of a better word, behavior or principles could be deepened in the world. I mean, it'd be extremely difficult to manage, but how would you quantify that? How would you measure that?
Yeah, and I think that's such such a complicated issue, and I love what you're saying. Like, I think it's absolutely wonderful, and I think it's possible to move in that direction. I'm not sure I have the answer for that, and maybe Tyson wants to speak to it. But I also want to say that something that I think could be part of the solution is also promoting train travel as well. And I know that stops at domestic, but at the same time, I think governments should be allocating a lot of funds to push train travel, to create and develop train travel, and to also subsidize train travel more, because it's just a wonderful way to reduce emissions and to actually continue allowing people to travel.
Yeah, there are some countries here in Europe, Jesse, and I think Europe is just far beyond a lot of the rest of the world. Canada, I think we're still living in the dark ages, when it comes to long distance train travel.
Yeah, it's a shame it hasn't been made a priority.
It just doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm curious also for you two, how your own travels in your lives might have come to bear on your production or pre-production and research in the film. Maybe you could tell us a little bit of how you've seen the world over the course of your life and your travels, and if that came to bear at all in the making of the film.
Personally, for me, I traveled extensively for 20 years prior to embarking on this film. I worked in the travel industry. I worked for an airline for many years. I was also a journalist, and I've done work for several large publications, which allowed me to travel to some very remote and exotic destinations around the world. This travel really exposed me to the beauty and the wonder of the world, but also the environmental and the cultural challenges that a lot of these destinations face. The experiences with travel for both work and for pleasure, I think they served as a catalyst for me just to delve deeper into this topic. And so when I was approached about directing and writing a film on this topic, I don't think there could have been a better fit. Like everything just kind of fell into place. And I just felt like I was really well poised because prior to that, I had traveled to 70 different countries in a number of different capacities. I had personally engaged in a number of behaviors that we were critical of in the film in terms of animal interaction, interaction with other cultures. And my travel through 2 decades was really an eye-opening and learning experience for me. And what this film really is, I think for me, and in many points in the film, is a reflection of my past travels and things that have been illuminated in my mind in terms of what are some important aspects that we really need to address if we want to be more conscious and responsible travelers.
And I think from my end, I surely had not traveled to as many destinations as Tyson, but I did indulge my wanderlust in my 20s and 30s. I lived in a few different countries, Holland, South Africa, Germany, Canada. And I think that the absolute best aspect for me personally of travel is meeting the people. I absolutely love meeting people in different cultures and seeing the differences and the similarities and learning the wisdom as much as I possibly can in such moment of my life when I'm in a destination, if it grants me such a gift. And I think from that, I still do have such a deep, deep gratitude to my privilege in being able to travel and meet such people. I've made such beautiful friendships over the course of 20 years, and many I still keep in touch with across the various places I've lived. And I think that when you come back, perhaps from living in different cultures in different countries, and you come back to your home, the place you were raised in, and where you were born, and where you were raised culturally, and you can note the vast differences. And it's not a negative thing, but you start to pick up on the ways in which many people can see different cultures or different countries in a way that is completely disconnected from the actual truth. And this knowledge often comes with privilege. I was privileged enough to be able to travel to these destinations, to meet certain people and to dissuade certain prejudices, but not everyone can. And so part of this film, I have to say, ironically, is that if you can't travel, this film is also a wonderful film to watch because it's something that you can meet these people in these destinations. There's so many places that I've been to also that, or so many places I have not been to that were featured in the film as well. And with documentary filmmaking, and especially as an editor, I really do feel like I get to know these people so well. And I don't think that's just exclusive to myself. I think audiences, hopefully, if I've done it correctly, if Tyson and I have made the film correctly, that these people's hearts have come through in the film. And this is something that Tyson and I really worked hard on. And I'm sorry if I'm deviating from the question a bit, but it does connect very deeply to my love of travel is people, and also my love of editing people. And so it was something we worked really hard to focus on is how do we give these people a podium? They have their voice. They're saying their truth. How do we give them a podium? And as the white filmmakers who are coming into different countries, how do we take a step back and really let them preach their wisdom? And so it was a balance for us really in finding the right voices, obviously speaking to the right professionals and speaking to professionals within different cultures that you see featured in the film, and really making sure that their knowledge, their voice, their direction was giving us direction on how we edited and formulated the story and stories of everyone that we met in the travels of the production as well.
And on that note, I'm curious for each of you, what was the most important topic or theme that came up in the film for you personally?
For me, maybe it's an echo of Jesse's sentiments there, but really it comes down to the impact on the communities that so graciously host us when we do travel. Travel, has an encyclopedia of challenges that come with traveling responsibly, unless we address the people. And I think we address this, and the film addresses this. But we can't begin to start focusing on the environment unless we first focus on the communities who were there and helping them emerge from poverty. We can't begin to focus on how we can solve the problem of poaching in the African savanna unless we first address the root causes of why it's there and how it affects the host communities and how poverty affects people's decisions to be involved in this trade.
And that was something that Jane Goodall was really adamant about speaking in the film about as well.
Yeah. And so to answer your question, Chris, I mean, ultimately it comes down to the communities and the people, the humanity of it all. First, we need to address the human aspect, and then we can address the secondary aspects of what it means to be a responsible traveler.
So for me personally, the most incredible voices in the film that when they came in, I just thought, oh, wow, were definitely Lek from Elephant Nature Park, and one of our contacts in Kenya, Judy Kafragona, who ended up being one of the main speakers and narrators throughout a huge portion of our film. These two women were just heroes. Like, just with Judy, with the words that she was able to express for the people working in not just only the tourism industry in Kenya, but the people of Kenya who were vulnerable to unethical tourism. And then speaking to so many different subjects that were connected to so many different stories worldwide with such eloquence and such power and such knowledge and courage, really. I think she spoke about these topics. I was just enamored, just blown away, and so grateful for her coming onto our film. And Lek Chilart is just a modern day hero. She is the tiniest woman with the biggest heart who, when I saw her story in our film against the backdrop of these beautiful giants, these elephants that she has rescued, and essentially she's an elephant whisperer in the truest sense of the word. And it's just such a magical thing to see. Listeners won't be able to understand this. I'm getting goosebumps when I just talk about her. And this was the kind of thing that when Tyson and I were looking through footage, looking through stories, that we were looking for. Oh, that's the moment. The moment. I got the goosebumps. That's it. It's there. When we found it in the stories, not just these two women, everyone you see featured in the story, and some that were left on the cutting room floor, unfortunately, that gave us beautiful insight that we still used in crafting the story that just wasn't able to make it into the actual film for timing constraints. But really, I would have to say that these two, it's not specifically the stories, although both of them touch on really important stories, including child welfare and animal welfare, which to me, those two stories were really close to my heart. And we felt really strongly that they needed a really important part in the film. But it was really these two women who I just felt so grateful for in the film.
I mean, the chapter on animal welfare was quite devastating for me, in part because it reminded me that in my early 20s, I had visited Thailand and I had gone to an elephant sanctuary, not a zoo, but a sanctuary, and had the opportunity to ride an elephant for a short time. And I felt really uncomfortable, probably because I was on top of an elephant, just the kind of immediate awkwardness of such a thing, having never seen one in person, having never experienced that before, but also kind of like, what am I doing here? And so that part of the film really kind of opened up for me why I felt that perhaps existential discomfort, not just about being on top of an animal of that size, but in the context of the dynamic around how that was happening and why that was happening and not having the context for it so long ago. And of course, this is one of the things that we touch on in the episodes, in the interviews, in the podcast, is how can we come to understand these things when our visits are so short in these places, when we are only in a place for just a very brief time. And there's really no context for the history and the culture and the political dynamics that surround these things. And then most travelers, most tourists just end up leaving. And the consequence of one's presence on the scene is kind of forgotten, at least by the tourist or traveler. Yeah, so thank you for that.
That question did come up actually at the recent screening of the film in Innsbruck at the Nature Film Festival, where someone in the audience asked very specifically, even though it would be great to stay at a destination for a long time, most people are saving up for short travel when they have time off work and they need to take this kind of tour because they can only afford this one. And what do you say to those people who want to travel better but feel like they're kind of stuck or don't know where to go? But I would say, in short, I think that touches on an issue that we have in the modern world with a lot of things. We are all overtired, overworked, and we don't have time to be ethical. We don't have time to do the research. We don't have time to investigate if anything is against our core value. And I get that. It's not easy for everybody. And if you do have the time and you are able to really do a deep dive, then you're very privileged because you have the time, which just means that you have the money. So we did try to give a lot of smaller tips at the end of the film in terms of how you can do smaller acts of kindness and of conscious traveling, to travel local, to put money into local economies, to make sure that you're not requesting your sheets to be washed every day, making sure that you're traveling using reusables, to make sure that and I guess this goes into a little bit more of the extensive questioning, is to ask the destination that you're traveling to what their policies are in connection with the locals, in connections with the environment. Unfortunately, there is a lot of greenwashing in tourism. And, that's in all industries right now worldwide. So it's not going to be so easy for someone who isn't an investigative journalist to really find out the truth behind it all the time. But we can do our best. And there are quite a few links on the website, thelasttouristfilm.com, where you can see some of the different organizations that we spoke with that have lists upon lists of different collaborating companies that you can look to that can show you places that are not greenwashing or that are working with locals. But back to the idea of taking the time, it is about taking the time, whether it's an hour even, just to take the time and do a bit of research. And this especially comes back to the topic of child welfare and people who are still en masse volunteering worldwide to orphanages, and orphanages where children have existing family members, and that these orphanages have become of monetary value to developing nations because they make money. And it's really easy for us to pass judgment on places that do this, and it's definitely wrong. But if we as travelers are going there and saying with our travel dollars, this is something we want to invest in, then people in developing nations are going to say, this is how I make money. And it's the same with animal welfare. You pay for an animal sanctuary that you haven't done the research on, they're going to keep perpetuating that cycle. It's going to be the same with child welfare. So if you do want to be ethical, you have to fit in a little bit of research in your travel time. And that's it. And I know it's not so easy for everybody.
Yeah, I'd like to expand a little bit on a theme that sort of both of you have talked about. Jesse, you had mentioned greenwashing. Chris, you had mentioned that you had been to an elephant sanctuary in Thailand. One of the most memorable takeaways that I had from this film is just the massive amount of greenwashing and deception that exists within the industry. I came to know a lot of companies that appeared to just be normal travel companies doing the same thing that has been going on in the travel industry, but marketing green, although nothing really changes. It's just their marketing strategy that's changed. If we look at, for example, in Thailand, there are a number of places that call themselves an elephant sanctuary, an elephant retirement home, an elephant rescue center. And we can't rely on those names anymore to know that the service provider is giving us an ethical experience. We really need to ask deeper questions. It's the trend in the industry now to use this type of language: sustainable, responsible, eco, all of these buzzwords. And I've just come to find these completely meaningless in those terms. We really need to ask some deeper, more challenging questions of these experiences and the tour operators and the service providers to actually know whether what they're doing is ethical or not. Because it is very easy to call yourself a sanctuary when in fact it's the complete opposite. If it truly was an elephant sanctuary, we wouldn't be able to ride the elephants in that place. And they would be providing them a life of dignity free from exploitation. And it's the same with children. Calling these places orphanages, I think it's a misnomer. It's incorrect. 70% of children who live in these quote unquote orphanages actually have at least one living parent. But it's all under the guise of trying to gain sympathy from the traveler. Oh, come see an elephant at a retirement home. Come see a child at an orphanage. It's just a piece of marketing that doesn't reflect the truth. We have a lot of companies doing the same unethical practices they've been doing for decades. However, they've just really changed their marketing to appear more green.
Yeah, it seems to be a never-ending cycle where responsible isn't good enough. Now we got to be regenerative. So many of these words just end up becoming marketing tools.
I'm hearing that word a lot more these days as well.
Yeah, so how do we proceed, not just with a degree of dedication towards research and planning, but also deep discipline as to how these words are, unfortunately, as you said, becoming kind of meaningless in their significance. And I want to take a little turn with you both to ask about what happened as the film was going through post-production and its release, because most of the footage that you have is quote unquote pre-pandemic, and the COVID-19 pandemic hit obviously in 2020. And from what I understand, your team was entering into the post-production process. And of course, tourism ground to a halt, almost completely worldwide. And throughout the film, there are people that you two interview that contend with the consequences and context of tourism and look to a more honorable path that it might take. But I'm curious in regards to the people that you did interview who had found a degree of success and perhaps within a more small scale, a more honorable way of doing tourism, that those flights, those trains, the reception of people in their villages went from 100 to 0. Basically overnight. So much of the dire consequences of tourism revolve around or end up as exile. Local people can't afford to produce food anymore in their places, and the education systems kind of move them towards getting jobs in the next city or even in other countries. And I'm curious, in the context of the film and I guess the treatment that you put forward, never perhaps thinking that something like this could happen, what was the fallout among the people that you interviewed in regards to their understandings of tourism? And if it was still this kind of, for lack of a better word, golden goose or calf or sacred cow that they could rely on for the rest of their lives, what did you hear kind of in the ether as you were doing that post-production?
I think it substantially expanded the wealth gap. I think during COVID, the people that were hit the hardest are the people in the tourism industry that often are paid the least, depending on what their jobs were. They were the ones who were suffering layoffs, and they were the ones whose businesses couldn't afford to sustain themselves. And so I think for the most vulnerable populations, the pandemic was absolutely devastating. People couldn't afford to put food on the table and pay rents. And not just, I think, in developing countries, but even in the developed world, airlines were laying off massive amounts of employees. Hotels were cutting staff. This was a global challenge that affected everyone. However, at that same time, we did hear stories that, CEOs of major airlines were taking $1 million bonuses for cutting costs. And that was an observation of mine through that experience, that the people who needed tourism the most for daily sustenance and to put bread on the table were the ones who were absolutely the most affected. And the people kind of at the top of the tourism industry were still fine, and they were also taking bonuses, which really bothered me. Just because the wealth gap just seemed to get further and further apart through that. But we do know with the stories that were featured in our film, there's a wonderful lodge in Ecuador, a homestay that we look at, and they lost their income during that time. The elephant sanctuary in Thailand, the one that does do great work, not one that greenwashes an elephant sanctuary, but they lost a lot of revenue where it was very challenging to feed the elephants and to house the elephants because they didn't have that revenue coming in to support the project.
There was also, we were hearing in Africa, right? Some of the rangers who were placed in defense of the elephants and animals and rhinos and such were just gone. They just weren't there anymore at that time because if they're not getting paid, they can't stay there. And so poaching also went up in those areas as well. But, you know, I think that in terms of what the positive was, I think a lot of people were hoping that post-COVID, that there was going to be hope for change, for renewal, for doing things differently. And I think this was when we were in post, that this was maybe potential to show people how things can be different by showing kind of the polar opposite and the effects, and also showing how intrinsically connected people's livelihoods are to this industry and how vulnerable they are to massive change like this. I mean, the Dominican Republic that has almost 90% of their GDP related to tourism.
Island nations are the ones who are most affected by tourism. You know, the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, the Caribbean islands specifically. I don't know if it's as high as 90%, but the vast majority of their GDP from island nations comes from the travel and tourism industry. And they were certainly hit the hardest during the pandemic.
Yeah, and so I think that we can see from that, I think the hope for us during post-production was, okay, you know, this is a horrific blow to the people most vulnerable in this industry. But if we can get this message out after the pandemic, perhaps this could be something that could really change. And to be fair, change is slow sometimes. And I mean, it's wishful thinking that post-pandemic, right after, that suddenly everyone was going to become ethical travelers. But I see so much potential just in the discussions online, people that we're meeting at different screenings, interest that we're getting worldwide, just to have these conversations and see that there is an interest in change. And when you talk about moving change, it does often come from the people. And I think across the world over the past few decades, we've all been seeing, again, I think our power as people, as citizens, as individuals, and the power that we have to come together over certain issues that we feel need radical change. And even if it is slow change, I do see the inklings of that change happening within the tourism industry. And I think it's really positive.
We still have a lot of work ahead of us.
Amen. I think that's really, really important and perhaps fits properly inside of the context of the dominant culture, at least of North America or the quote unquote West, wherein the pandemic also produced a deepening of the culture of everything now. Suddenly it was like, okay, well, I can't go out here, so everything has to be deliverable and at the tip of your fingers, right? And what might come with that is this notion that we also expect social change to happen overnight, right? And that it might be overshadowed by this kind of dominant culture of wanting everything now. And also the unwillingness to do the necessary work, which is sometimes generational, right? Not just a week or a month or a year, but generations. In that regard, the themes of the film are extremely broad, and you go into a lot of detail and depth with each, so I'm very grateful for that. But I'm also curious what might have gotten left out, what might one day end up on a director's cut of the film.
Oh, so much. Tyson, how much?
Yeah, ask the editor.
Well, I mean, you had so many stories that you brought to the table that were beautiful, beautiful stories. Forgive me, I don't remember his name, and you'll remember Tyson. But one of the
you're talking about, yeah.
Oh, do you? One of the men you interviewed at the UN had a really beautiful story to tell, and then we also had a really beautiful story from Costa Rica. an animal welfare and environmental story. Oh my goodness. There were so many stories.
We had a wonderful story from Cusco, Peru, with an organization that was putting the first female porters on the Inca Trail and really fighting for gender equality on the Inca Trail.
What's that company's name again, Tyson? Well, the reason why I bring it up is because it's so unique that I just think, oh, we should definitely highlight that to listeners, because they were taking female porters and they were reorganizing the whole industry based on their precedent, because they were treating porters with dignity, with safe conditions, with valuable wages. And this is something that's just not done across the industry on the Inca Trail with the male porters. And there was some really, really horrific footage that we came across of the way these porters were living, just not too far from where the tourists were sleeping comfortably in their tents. And this is a wide practice across the industry. And Miguel from this company, Evolution Trucks. And Miguel, do you remember his full name, Tyson?
Miguel Gongora.
From Evolution Trucks. Yeah, a wonderful, wonderful man who was really, really passionate about changing the industry. And we spoke with many of the female porters. And yeah, that was a story that we were really, really sad to lose that story. Yeah.
Yeah, with only 90 minutes, we really had to make some challenging decisions on what to be included in the film. And I really feel that a 90-minute film can scratch the surface. It can spark some interest in a number of these themes, but certainly, and maybe that's next steps for us, but I certainly think that what these subject matter deserves is a series, because we could dive much deeper.
Tyson and I have been talking about it.
Yeah, we can dive much deeper into each of these subjects and create a 90-minute doc on each of them. And so at some point in the future, we'll be making some pitches and writing some additional treatments into how we can make a 6-part series and expand on the themes in this film, from the environment to gender inequality to animal welfare, and everything deserves a lot more time. But hopefully what we've done with this film is just been able to spark a number of conversations and inspire people to go and do some additional research into how these themes impact these communities.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for that. I have a lot more questions, but maybe that'll also be saved for a sequel.
Yeah, we'd love to speak to you again, Chris, if you'd like in the future.
That would be great. Before we finish, I'd like to ask you what might be next for you two in your respective filmmaking and writing lives.
My world currently revolves around photographing wildlife, particularly large wildlife. Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time traveling recently and in the ocean. I mentioned to you, tomorrow I'm hopping on a flight and I'm heading to Norway to go photograph large marine mammals in Norway. So that's where my life is taking me right now, is in pursuit of wildlife filmmaking and photography.
Although I wish I could say similarly. Right now my life is a little bit calmer. I had a baby 20 months ago, so I've been on an extended maternity leave, and I'm currently just in development of projects for the future. I finished up this project in full right before my child was born, and I still have a few projects that were finished up recently, but as of the moment, I'm completely in development. And yeah, I really look forward to developing something with Tyson in the future in regards to what he was talking about, a series on travel and on a lot of the stories that we were so passionate and so blessed to come across, but that we just didn't have the ability to give the podium to in our film. But yeah, so I'm really excited for the future. Just coming from this festival that I was at recently, I'm just so invigorated with the energy of the audiences and the passion to travel better and to demand better travel from the industry and from travelers as a whole. So this just really gives me a lot of hope.
Well, congratulations on your motherhood and having a little one in your life and this work, and Tyson on the opportunity to be able to travel as you do and to try to honor the lives of those beautiful four-leggeds and no-leg and the tailed finned ones. Yeah. So finally, how can our listeners watch The Last Tourist? Are there any screenings coming up?
definitely on the website, thelasttouristfilm.com. Right when you go to the webpage, there's a whole list of all the different avenues you can watch the film. But maybe Tyson could elaborate more.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can connect with us on Instagram at Last Tourist Film as well. We're just kind of wrapping up the fall festival season before we do some additional screenings next spring. We just wrapped up in Germany and Iceland. I think streaming is the best way to find us. In Canada, we're streaming on Crave. In the United States, we're streaming on Hulu, Delta Airlines, Emirates Airlines. In other countries around the world, you can also find us, I know, in France and French Polynesia, Hong Kong, on Amazon Prime. And there's a number of other markets that the film will be opening in very shortly, which is really exciting. It's not available everywhere, unfortunately, around the world. But if you have a desire to see it, please get in touch with us, and we'll do our best to make sure that you have an opportunity to see the film. You can host a private screening. There's a number of ways that you can see this film. But please, let's keep the conversation going. Let's get in touch. I'd love to hear from a number of the listeners, and let's find a way that we can allow everyone to see this film.
And what's been really exciting is we've got a lot of interest from schools. So educational screenings have been happening all across the world, and that's just been amazing. Those are the best for us, I think. And I would just say, if any of the listeners have any further questions for us, we're always open to taking questions and chatting. Personally, Tyson and I can both be reached at our Instagram. So you can, I think Tyson's is at Tyson Sadler, and mine is at Jesse Mann, 2 S's, 2 N's. So if you want to leave that for your listeners, they're welcome to contact us. And anyone who's listening can contact us directly that way if you want to host a screening or find out ways to watch.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll make sure that all the websites and handles are available for our listeners at theendofTourism.com. And on behalf of them, on behalf of myself, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. Your film is incredibly inspirational, necessary, and deeply important for these times. And I don't doubt that our listeners think the same. So I wish you the most beautiful paths ahead in your travels with your families. And we get the opportunity to speak again sometime.
Thank you, Chris. This has really been a meaningful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us this space. And I wish you all the same.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Pod. If what you heard had its way with you, if it left you with more questions than answers, then click subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or directly at chrischristu.substack.com. You can also follow us on social media via the handle The End of Tourism. I'd like to especially thank Alexei Galar for his assistance in the post-production process of this episode and many others in this season of The Pod. You can check out his sound design and original music work at alexeigalar.com. If you'd like to support The Pod in other ways, we'd love assistance in the form of post-production editing and promotion, or anything else you feel called to offer. Until next time, farewell, friends.